The wind whispered through the pine trees like a spirit unsettled, brushing against the tin roofs of the wooden barracks that had become a halfway world between war and peace. The camp was quiet as any place could be after midnight. But for the women lying in the dark, sleep was never easy. It came in fragments, the kind of sleep that carried memories from another continent, of fire, rubble, the sky lit with flame over Hamburg, and stitched them into dreams that turned suddenly into nightmares. Greta Hoffman lay awake, arms wrapped around her thin frame, a blanket pulled tight to her chin. The barracks creaked with the settling of old wood and distant footsteps. She stared at the ceiling where moonlight flickered through the frost-glazed window, casting the bars of her bunk bed in shifting shadows. Then, boots, distant, slow, but growing louder. The sound echoed down the wooden hallway. Not hurried, not chaotic, but deliberate. Heavy American boots on cold planks. Greta's breath stopped. Other women stirred. Across the room, Anna drew in a sharp breath. Marta sat up without a word, already clutching her coat. Someone whispered, "They're coming." Everyone had heard the stories. Rumors carried like smoke, things that happened to prisoners at night. Whispers told by the Italian girls before they were transferred. Fragments spoken in the back corners of mess lines. The worst things always came after dark. Greta swallowed hard. Her knuckles clenched the edge of the blanket. She remembered the way the guards had looked at her during roll call. Tall, stone-faced, unreadable. She'd survived the bombings in Kiel, the terror in the bunkers, the surrender, the train to France, the ship across the ocean, the long ride in the back of a military truck through the American South. But here, in the quiet of the pine forest, it was the unknown that terrified her most. There was a click. The latch turned. The door creaked open. A flood of white light spilled in from the hallway, harsh, blinding. The women shielded their eyes, every muscle braced. A hand reached into the room, but it did not hold a rifle. It held a blanket, thick wool, folded neatly. Behind the guard, another man entered. Arms filled with more blankets, his breath visible in the cold air. No orders were shouted. No one was dragged from bed. No punishments, no accusations. The guards moved slowly, quietly. One by one, they laid the blankets across the empty ends of bunks. Some they placed gently on sleeping forms. Others they draped over shivering shoulders. Greta didn't move. She couldn't. The tall guard, the one who always checked the windows before lights out, stepped toward her bed. For a moment, his shadow loomed large on the wall, swallowing the light. Then he knelt, unfolded the blanket, and laid it carefully across her without a word. Greta opened her mouth, but no sound came. Only her breath, quick and visible. The man didn't look at her. His expression was not cruel, not kind either, just steady, human. He stood up, nodded once, and turned to leave. Another guard whispered something in English, too soft to understand, then chuckled. The door closed. The light vanished. The boots faded into the distance. Silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence. For a long while, no one spoke. Then Anna, in the bunk above, whispered, "Why would they?" No one answered. Greta ran her fingers over the edge of the wool. It was coarse, warm, real. She pulled it tighter, pressing it to her face. It smelled faintly of cedar and army soap. And suddenly, everything she had been taught, everything about the enemy, about the Americans, about what awaited them here, began to fracture. She had been told they would be brutal. She had been told there would be hunger, interrogation, humiliation. But here was warmth. Here was mercy, delivered in silence. with no expectation of thanks. The room remained still, but something invisible had shifted. A weight had been placed not on their backs, but inside them. What did it mean, Greta wondered, if the enemy treated you better than your own government ever had? She did not sleep that night, nor did the others, but none of them were cold. By morning, the frost had melted from the inside of the barrack windows. A faint smell of boiled coffee drifted through the wooden corridors of Camp Ruston, mixing with the damp scent of pine and old laundry. Outside, the sun was pale and low, casting long shadows across the dirt parade grounds. Greta Hoffman stepped out into the chill air, boots crunching lightly over frozen grass. Her new blanket was folded carefully over her arm, as if it were a relic, something not hers, but given. Around her, the other women filed out in silence, eyes squinting, shoulders drawn tight, waiting for this moment to turn. But nothing turned. There were no barking orders, no angry inspections. Only a quiet gesture from a corporal with a clipboard, waving them toward a long, low building marked by steam curling from a roof vent. It was the shower house. Greta stopped. Her feet went still. She looked at Anna, who glanced back with the same question behind her eyes. Real showers? They hadn't had one in weeks, not since the transport ship. Even then, it was little more than cold spray and rough soap. Before that, it had been the camps in France, where lice were more common than clean towels. And before that, Hamburg. In Hamburg, the water had stopped running entirely. The bombings had cracked the mains. For months, Greta had washed with rags, dipped in boiled water scraped from broken pipes. She remembered standing behind a curtain of blankets, trying to scrub soot from her skin while bombs fell 2 blocks away. Now she stepped inside. The heat hit her like a wall. Humid, heavy, real. The room was bare concrete, lined with metal pipes and hanging nozzles. Buckets sat in corners. Steam clung to the ceiling like a ghost that refused to leave. There were American Red Cross signs on the wall. Instructions in German. Everything orderly, everything clean. Then came the sound. The hiss. Water, hot and pressurized, came pouring down from the ceiling. It hit the concrete floor and echoed like rain on a tin roof. Greta didn't move at first. She watched one woman, Sabine, tall and stiff with fear, step forward and raise her hands under the stream, her face twisted, not in pain, in disbelief. A moment later, Anna laughed. A dry, cracked laugh, short and nervous, but unmistakably real. Greta blinked. That sound, a laugh, had not passed the lips of anyone in their barrack for weeks, maybe months, and now it echoed through the steam like it didn't know it didn't belong there. She stepped forward. The water came down in a rush, hot, steady, rich with the smell of iron and soap. Real soap. A bar was pressed into her hand by a female American medic standing at the entrance. Not powdered disinfectant, not coal ash, but a smooth brown block stamped with U.S. Army Quartermaster. She held it in both hands like a sacred object, and when the water hit her, she let go. Her knees bent slightly under the weight of it, not just the heat, but the release. The ache behind her eyes, the salt on her lips, the feeling of months being washed off her skin. She rubbed the soap along her collarbone, her wrists, her neck. She scrubbed until her skin stung. Around her, others wept quietly. They weren't ashamed of it. The steam masked their tears. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The sound of the water said everything. For Greta, it was not just the cleansing of her body. It was the first time in years that she felt like a human being again. And that was dangerous, because the Americans were not supposed to make her feel this way. They were supposed to be monsters. The enemy. The ones who burned their cities and brought the war across the ocean. But here they were, giving blankets, giving hot water, giving soap. Greta stared at the medic by the door. A woman, maybe 30, with a tired smile and red hair tucked under her cap. Their eyes met for a second. The American nodded gently. Greta's chest tightened. She looked away. How do you reconcile kindness from someone you were taught to fear? What happens when your enemy restores your dignity, not with words, but with a bar of soap and a hot pipe in a room that smells like mercy? That night, Greta wrote her first letter home. She didn't know if it would ever reach Hamburg or if her mother was still alive, but she wrote it anyway, and in it, she said only one sentence. Mother, today I took a hot shower. They gave us soap. I did not know I could still feel like a person. The ink froze halfway through the word person. Greta sat at the edge of her bunk, pen trembling in her hand. The mess hall had long gone quiet, and the only light came from a single bulb that hummed softly above the door. It was December 18th, 1945, 1 week before Christmas. In the corner of the barrack sat a wooden crate stamped, "Mail, outgoing." Every prisoner was allowed 2 letters per month, no longer than 2 pages, written on the thin gray stationery provided by the camp. Each would pass through an American censor's hands before being shipped across the Atlantic in canvas sacks aboard Liberty ships returning home from the war. Greta looked at what she had written. Only a few sentences. Not about the war, not about the capture. Just about the shower, the blankets, the strange kindness that left her more confused than comforted. She hesitated, then folded the paper carefully, sliding it into the thin envelope. She addressed it to Frau Helene Hoffmann, Hamburg, Germany. There was no guarantee the city still existed in any recognizable way. The last she had seen of Hamburg was smoke, black towers rising over the Elbe, glass melted in the streets, houses gutted like open wounds. Yet something inside her insisted she write. When she sealed the envelope, she realized her hands were shaking. The next morning, she lined up with the other women outside the mess hall. Frost glittered on the fence wire like glass threads. A guard collected the letters one by one, flipping through them with the efficiency of a man used to handling secrets. When he reached Greta, she hesitated. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His were gray, almost colorless. He took her letter, turned it over once, and dropped it into the sack. That night, an American sergeant named William Tate sat at a wooden desk in the camp's small administrative office. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and pencil shavings. His job, like so many others, was not glamorous. Read every letter written by prisoners, black out anything considered dangerous or political, and stamp the envelope with "Approved by U.S. Army Examiner." He'd read hundreds that week, most filled with longing, sickness, and coded grief. But this one was different. It was short, simple, written in careful German script. Mother, today I took a hot shower. They gave us soap. I did not know I could still feel like a person. Tate stopped reading. He didn't cross out a single word. He set the letter aside, stared at it for a while, then folded it neatly and slid it into the approved pile. Maybe it was the honesty of it. Maybe it reminded him of the way his own sister wrote to their mother from nurses' training in Chicago. Careful, precise, but full of unspoken hurt. Whatever the reason, he didn't censor it. 3 weeks later, the letter arrived in Hamburg. It had taken a train from Louisiana to New York, crossed the Atlantic in a metal sack, passed through Army Post Office 772 in Bremerhaven, and been sorted by German workers still wearing coats against the cold. Helene Hoffmann received it on January 12, 1946. She was standing in line for bread when the postman handed it to her. The return address, Kriegsgefangenenlager Camp Ruston, USA, made her knees buckle. She stepped out of line, clutching it to her chest like it was something alive. Back in her half-collapsed apartment, she sat near the broken window, snow blowing across the floorboards. She tore the envelope open with shaking fingers, and she read. The words were few, but they hit like thunder. A shower, soap, warmth, feeling human again. Helene wept quietly. For months, she had pictured her daughter starving, beaten, humiliated in some foreign prison. She had imagined dark cells and shouted orders, the same cruelty that had flooded their own streets. Instead, her daughter wrote about soap, about kindness, and in that small miracle of a letter, Helene realized something terrible and beautiful all at once. Perhaps the world was not divided into monsters and victims, as the newspapers once said. Perhaps the line was thinner, softer. Perhaps people, even those called enemies, could still do what was right when no one was watching. That night, she placed the letter in a tin box under her bed, beside a few family photographs that had survived the bombings. She read it every night until the paper began to fray. The neighbors heard her whisper sometimes in the dark, "The Americans gave my daughter soap." To them, it sounded like nonsense. To her, it was salvation. Back in Camp Ruston, Greta did not know her letter had made it. She went about her days, washing laundry, mending uniforms, serving food in the mess hall. The guards spoke less now, and the war, the real war, seemed 1,000 miles away. But every night, she wondered whether her words had survived the ocean, whether anyone still called her daughter, whether the act of writing had mattered at all. She never saw her letter again, but somewhere across the Atlantic, on a night just as cold as hers, a candle burned beside a window in a ruined German apartment. And the flame did not go out. Morning came slow that January. A pale Louisiana dawn that crept through the pine trees and spilled like thin milk over the frozen dirt of Camp Ruston. Inside the barracks, the women stirred at the sound of a bell. Not an alarm, not a shout, but a gentle clang that echoed through the corridors like the toll of a faraway church. Greta sat up on her bunk, still wrapped in her wool blanket. The air was cold, but the kind of cold that could be tamed. Not the bone-cracking frost of Germany's ruins. She tied her hair back with a scrap of ribbon she'd saved since before capture, then buttoned her prisoner's coat. Anna was already standing by the door, rubbing her hands together. "What is that smell?" Anna whispered. Greta frowned. It was faint at first. Warm, unfamiliar, alive. Then she recognized it. Fried eggs. For a moment, neither woman moved. The smell drifted through the gaps in the wooden walls, carried by the morning wind. Then came another scent. Bread, toasted, real, and butter melting. It couldn't be real. They had learned not to believe their senses. For months, they'd lived off watery soup and hard biscuits, sometimes moldy, sometimes nothing at all. Even aboard the transport ship, food had been rationed like punishment. A thin layer of jam on dry bread, if you were lucky. But here, now, the air was thick with warmth and grease, and something they hadn't felt since before the sirens in Hamburg. Home. When the door opened, the guards didn't bark commands. They simply gestured toward the mess hall. Inside, the smell grew stronger. A dozen long tables lined the room, each with metal trays stacked neatly beside tin cups. Behind the serving counter stood American cooks, one whistling softly, another flipping eggs on a hot griddle. Steam rose in lazy curls toward the rafters. Greta stepped forward with her tray. Her heart pounded like it did before air raids, though she couldn't explain why. "Next," one of the cooks said, not unkindly. He was middle-aged, with sunburned skin and a jaw that looked permanently clenched from chewing tobacco. He dropped 2 fried eggs onto her tray, followed by a scoop of potatoes and, impossibly, a small pat of butter. Real butter. Greta stared at it. Yellow, soft, melting into the warmth of the eggs. She looked up, meeting the man's eyes. He raised an eyebrow. "Go on, miss," he said, nodding toward the tables. Eat before it gets cold." She nodded faintly and stepped aside. Her hands shook as she sat down beside Anna. Across the table, Sabine was already eating, eyes half closed, lips pressed together, as if she feared the taste might vanish if she breathed too hard. The first bite was slow. The yolk burst on her tongue. Hot, rich, alive. The salt of it made her eyes sting. She wasn't sure if it was flavor or grief that burned her throat. Anna laughed softly. "They're feeding us like soldiers." Greta swallowed, barely able to speak. Like people. They ate in silence after that. At the end of the table, one of the guards stood with his back to the stove, coffee mug in hand. He didn't watch them eat. He looked out the window, lost in thought, as though this entire ritual, feeding those who had been enemies weeks ago, was something he, too, was trying to understand. Outside, a truck rumbled past, carrying fresh sacks of flour. The American flag fluttered faintly above the camp gate. Somewhere, a phonograph played scratchy jazz, and inside the mess hall, German women who had once believed America was a land of monsters sat eating breakfast, their hands trembling over the simplest proof that those monsters could cook, could care, could choose mercy when cruelty would have been easier. After the meal, Greta stayed behind to help clean trays. She volunteered. No one asked her. She wanted to understand how such abundance could exist so casually. Behind the counter, she saw shelves lined with tins of coffee, bags of sugar, and jars of fruit preserves. Everything organized, labeled, endless. The cook noticed her staring. "You all right there, miss?" She nodded. "We thought you hated us." He paused mid-wipe, then gave a small shrug. "War's over," he said simply. "Hate don't feed nobody." She didn't answer. The phrase sank deep into her chest, quiet as falling ash. That night, back in the barracks, the women talked long after lights out. They whispered about the breakfast, about the taste of butter, about the guards who never shouted. One woman said she saw an American give his own gloves to a prisoner working in the yard. Another claimed she'd overheard a guard asking the chaplain to find more blankets for the ladies in Block C. The stories sounded impossible, but so had the eggs. As Greta lay awake, she realized something had begun to erode inside them. Not quickly, not like glass shattering, but like ice melting under sunlight. The propaganda that had filled their heads since girlhood, that the Americans were soulless, barbaric, bent on revenge, could not survive the warmth of butter on toast. It wasn't that she forgot what had happened. The bombings, the loss, the humiliation of defeat. It was that the hatred she had carried had no place to stand anymore. Kindness had taken its ground. When she closed her eyes, she saw her mother again, standing in that broken apartment, reading her letter by candlelight. She imagined her whispering, "The Americans gave my daughter soap." Now Greta could have added another line, "And they gave us breakfast with butter." It was a small thing. An egg, a smile, a phrase. But in that simple act, she understood how wars truly end. Not when the guns go silent, but when one enemy feeds another without asking why. Greta noticed him again 3 nights later. The same tall guard with the square jaw and quiet boots, the one who had laid the blanket over her chest in the first cold week of December. He walked the perimeter like clockwork, always with his cap tucked down low, hands behind his back, saying nothing unless asked. His name, she had overheard someone say, was Corporal Lawrence Fisher. He didn't seem like the others. He didn't smoke with the rest of the guards near the motor pool, didn't joke in the mess hall. He moved like a man who had seen more than he spoke of, and carried it quietly beneath his coat. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. Camp Ruston stood silent beneath a thin sheet of frost, the air sharp enough to burn the throat. Greta had stayed late in the barracks laundry room, folding uniforms under the dim yellow light. Her hands were raw from soap and steam. As she stepped out into the dark, she saw him. Corporal Fisher stood near the chapel. staring up at the moon as if trying to remember something he'd lost in it. In his arms, a folded wool blanket. He noticed her, nodded once, and turned to walk toward Block B. But something made Greta speak. "Excuse me," she said softly. He stopped, turned back. She hesitated. Then, "You were the one who brought the blankets that night, weren't you?" He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her, expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am. That was me." The air between them tightened. Greta felt her breath cloud in the space separating them. Two people on opposite sides of everything. "I didn't thank you," she said. "You don't need to," he replied. It was cold. His voice was deeper than she expected. Slow. Southern. Greta looked down. "We thought you were coming to hurt us." Fisher exhaled, a sound almost like a chuckle, but without amusement. "You're not the only ones who were told stories." That stopped her. She looked up. "What kind of stories?" He shrugged. "That German women were proud, cold, that they believed in the Reich and nothing else." Greta blinked, and now? He glanced toward the barracks. "Now I see women who cry in the showers. Women who fold laundry like they're building something holy. Women who say thank you even when no one's looking." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken about them like that. Not since the surrender. Not without contempt. Fisher adjusted the blanket in his hands. "This one's for a girl in C4. She's coughing again." Greta nodded. "Sabine, she's been cold all week?" For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she asked the question that had lived in her chest for weeks. "Why are you kind to us?" He looked at her for a long time. "Because I went to church with my mother every Sunday. Because I was raised to do what's right, even when it doesn't make sense. Because you're not our enemy anymore. Not here. Not now." Greta felt her throat tighten. Something unspoken passed between them. Not affection, not understanding, but recognition. Two people caught in the soft aftermath of a war neither had started. He tipped his cap. "Get inside before you freeze." She nodded. "Good night, Corporal." "Good night, Miss Hoffman." She blinked. He knew her name. She watched him walk toward Block C. The blanket tucked carefully beneath his arm, as if it mattered more than anything he carried during the war. Back in the barracks, she sat on her bunk and stared at her folded blanket. It was the same one he'd given her weeks ago. She ran her fingers along the edge. In that moment, it wasn't wool. It was memory. It was her mother's hands, straightening her coat before school. It was the hush of a lullaby in a house that no longer stood. It was dignity, restored in silence. Greta laid back, eyes open to the wooden ceiling above, and let the warmth of the night settle over her. The war had taught her to survive cold, but kindness, that she was still learning to endure. Outside, Corporal Fisher walked beneath the pine trees. No fanfare, no medals, just a blanket and a name remembered. And that was enough. The next kindness did not come from a soldier. It came from a man in a wool coat and a soft crumpled hat. The camp chaplain, Reverend Samuel Ellison. He walked with a slight limp and carried a leather satchel that always seemed too heavy for one man, but never left his shoulder. Most of the women didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't armed, didn't shout, didn't supervise work crews. He simply wandered between barracks, across the mess yard, sometimes sitting with the sick in the infirmary, reading quietly beside them in English, even though they could not understand the words. On a gray afternoon in late January, Reverend Ellison returned from town carrying a crate. The guards at the gate looked surprised. One leaned over and asked, "That's not government issue, sir?" "No," the chaplain said with a tired smile. "It's from God's orchard, by way of Mr. Langley's farm outside town." Inside the crate were apples, red, whole, unrotted, glossy from the cold. 42 of them, hand-picked, packed in straw, not army surplus. Not canned, not powdered, not boiled. Real apples. He wheeled the crate across the frozen yard himself, pushing it on an old cart with one squeaky wheel. Snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes that caught in his hair and melted on his shoulders. By the time he reached the women's compound, the prisoners had gathered near the fences. They hadn't seen fruit in months. Some hadn't seen a fresh apple since 1943. Greta was among them. She stood still, hand around the wrist of Sabine, whose cough had worsened. When she saw the fruit, something shifted in her chest. The chaplain stopped just inside the compound gate. "You'll have to share," he said with a sheepish grin, lifting one apple into the air like a magician producing gold. "But I figure the Lord knew how to divide loaves. Surely we can manage apples." He handed them out one by one. No guards, no roll call, no ration slips. When he placed an apple into Greta's hands, he didn't say a word. But his eyes, blue and sad and filled with a knowing kind of peace, seemed to ask, "Do you remember this? Do you remember the world before hate?" Greta stared at the fruit in her palm. It was cold to the touch, firm, still dusted with a trace of field soil. She turned it over, studying the bruise on one side. She didn't bite it, not at first. She just held it like something sacred. Around her, women were laughing. Small, breathless laughs, like someone had opened a forgotten window in the soul. One sat on a barrel and sang half a lullaby. Another ran to get a knife to cut slices and share. Greta finally lifted the apple and took a bite. The crunch echoed in her head. Sweetness flooded her tongue, tart and bright and sharp like memory. She was no longer at Camp Ruston. She was 5 years old, sitting on the back step of her family's house in Altona, watching her father carve apples into thin curls. He would peel them in one unbroken ribbon and place them on her tongue like communion. He had died in 42, conscripted, wounded, and gone without ceremony. She hadn't tasted that moment since. Greta dropped to the bench, tears rolling down her cheeks, not sobbing, just water, as natural and necessary as breath. Across the yard, Anna held her own apple to her chest like a child would a doll. She whispered, "They're feeding us what our families can't even find in the ruins." It was true. In post-war Germany, apples were more myth than food. In Hamburg, children climbed into rubble for crusts of bread. Here, in the land of the enemy, fruit fell into their hands like an undeserved mercy. After the apples were gone, the chaplain remained. He sat with them under the awning of the barrack, speaking slow English that none of them fully understood. But it didn't matter. His presence said more than words. At one point, he lifted his satchel and removed something wrapped in cloth. A harmonica. He played softly, an old hymn, perhaps, or a lullaby. The tune rose over the fence line and into the fading light. That night, Greta couldn't sleep. The apple core still sat on her shelf, browning slowly, a relic of something too beautiful to throw away. She picked it up and wrapped it in a scarf, tucking it into her drawer with her folded blanket and the worn soap bar. These were her proofs now. Proof that not all enemies were monsters. Proof that kindness could arrive in silence. Proof that sometimes salvation came with skin and seeds. And she wondered, as she drifted into sleep, if her mother had eaten that winter. If somewhere, in the ruins, there was even a single apple left. If not, then maybe the fruit she held tonight had come from both of their memories. And maybe, just maybe, the war inside her was ending too. The sewing room at Camp Ruston wasn't much to look at. Just a narrow wooden shed near the supply building, with 3 windows so clouded by dust they barely let in the sun. Inside, bolts of faded fabric leaned against one wall, and 2 foot-powered sewing machines stood like old soldiers at attention. It had started as a work assignment. A few women, those who knew how to sew, had been asked to help repair worn uniforms and blankets. Greta volunteered, not because she wanted to serve the American army, but because she needed something to do with her hands, something to steady the mind. She hadn't threaded a needle since the last winter before her capture. Back then, she'd helped mend refugee coats in Hamburg, patching sleeves for children who no longer had homes. But this was different. Here, in this quiet room, she sat side by side with women who had once believed in victory. Now they sat among torn fabric and silence, working not for country or cause, but simply because things needed mending. Each morning, Greta stepped into the sewing room just after roll call. She'd nod to Corporal Fisher, who often stood outside with his thermos, and then disappear into the stillness of the cloth. The first uniform she repaired had a rip along the shoulder seam. She turned it inside out, examined the stitching. American issue wool, coarse, gray, meant for endurance, not comfort. She sewed it shut with thread almost the same color as her own prisoner coat. When she handed it back, the guard didn't speak. He looked at the sleeve, then at her, and gave a nod. Not thanks, just acknowledgement, but somehow it mattered. Anna joined her the second week. Then Sabine, cough softened now by the medicine and the extra blankets. Soon, 4 women sat shoulder to shoulder in the sewing shed, each lost in thought, stitching in rhythm to the slow ticking of the wall clock. One day, a box of odd garments arrived. Donated civilian clothes, meant to be refitted for wounded veterans passing through the base. Among them was a cotton dress with a torn hem, light blue, faint floral pattern. Greta froze when she touched it. The fabric reminded her of her mother's Sabbath dress, the one she wore every spring Sunday before the war tore the calendar apart. She picked up the needle and began to repair it, her fingers shaking slightly. With each stitch, a memory rose. Her mother bending over a garden bed, pressing her palm to Greta's forehead, singing as she hung laundry in the wind. The women worked in silence, but the room became fuller with each passing day, not with voices, but with the quiet hum of healing. And then, one afternoon, an American officer entered. He wasn't young. Salt in his hair, creases around his eyes. He carried a bundle under one arm. Greta straightened. He placed the bundle gently on the table. This belonged to a boy in the 94th. His mother asked if we could fix it before we sent it home. He unfolded the garment. It was a field jacket torn down the side, stained with what had long dried. The name tape still clung to the chest. B. McAllister. No one asked what had happened. They knew. The officer looked down, cleared his throat. She wanted it. Mended. Said she'd rather remember him whole. Then he left. The room was quiet. Greta stepped forward and touched the jacket. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she picked up the needle. She stitched in silence. Careful, reverent. Every pass of the thread was slower than usual, pulled tight with something that felt like prayer. Not for the dead soldier, for his mother. That night, Greta didn't sleep. She thought of the jacket, of the young man who wore it, of the blue dress that reminded her of home. She had spent so long believing uniforms were the shell of the enemy. But in the sewing room, the shell had been torn open, and inside it, thread, flesh, memory, no different than hers. One morning near the end of January, as Greta folded a stack of mended garments, Corporal Fisher stepped inside. He held out a clean piece of cloth. Thought you could use this for lining. She took it. Their fingers brushed. He lingered. You've done good work, he said quietly. She looked up. It helps. He nodded. Funny how fixing small things makes the big ones feel less broken. She thought about that as he turned and left. She looked at the spool of thread in her hand. War had unraveled her world. But here, in this shed, with a needle in her fingers and the soft sound of sewing all around her, she was learning how to bind things together again. one torn sleeve at a time. February arrived with gray skies and a strange quiet that hung over Camp Ruston like a held breath. The war had been over for months, yet the air still trembled with what it used to mean to survive. The women no longer jumped at footsteps, no longer feared the guards' approach, but they still carried a tension beneath the skin, like a note that refused to fade. That morning, word spread. A Red Cross delegation was coming. It was the first official inspection since the German women had arrived. The camp buzzed with a nervous energy. Some prisoners ironed their uniforms. Others whispered about what to say, what not to say. Greta stood by the window, watching the American flag ripple weakly in the wind. She didn't know what she would tell them if asked. The Red Cross men arrived just after noon. Two of them, one Swiss, one Swedish, dressed in wool coats with a distinctive red emblem stitched onto the sleeve. They carried clipboards and small notebooks, speaking in calm, neutral tones. The guards stood aside respectfully as they entered. The camp commander, a broad-shouldered man named Major Reynolds, led them through the gates. By mid-afternoon, they reached the women's compound. Greta and Anna were among those chosen to represent their group. They stood in line near the barrack door as the inspectors approached, the snow crunching softly under polished boots. The Swiss man spoke first. His German was formal, accented. "You are treated well?" he asked. Greta hesitated. The words caught in her throat. The inspector looked at her kindly. "You may speak freely," he added. "No guard will punish you for honesty." Around her, the women exchanged uncertain glances. It was a simple question, but none of them could answer it. How does one explain what it means to be treated better by the enemy than by one's own homeland? How do you describe the warmth of blankets when your family sleeps in rubble? The taste of butter when your brother starves? The silence of mercy when the world told you to expect cruelty? Anna was the first to speak. "We are safe," she said slowly. The inspector nodded. "And your food?" "It's good," another woman said. "Too good." A faint, confused smile tugged at the inspector's lips. "Too good?" Greta found her voice. "It is strange," she said quietly, "to be prisoners and yet to eat more than our families." The inspector's pen paused over his notebook. Major Reynolds shifted uncomfortably beside him. "We follow the Geneva Convention, sir," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." But Greta saw the truth in his eyes. It was more. It always had been. The Swedish delegate turned to her next. "And the guards? Have there been incidents?" "No," Greta said. Her voice was firm now. "They do not harm us. They help." The man studied her expression for a long moment, perhaps searching for a flicker of fear or irony. He found none. He nodded and made a note. When the inspection ended, the visitors thanked the commander and walked back toward the gate. But as they passed the mess hall, the Swiss inspector stopped. He looked back at Greta. "Fräulein," he said softly, "you look well-fed and clean. You speak calmly. You say you are treated humanely. That is good." He hesitated. "But when you go home, and they ask you how it was here, what will you tell them?" Greta opened her mouth, but no answer came. She thought of her mother reading her letter by candlelight. She thought of Corporal Fisher laying the blanket across her shoulders, the chaplain handing her an apple, the laughter in the shower house, the warmth of fried eggs, and she thought of the ruins of Hamburg. "I will tell them," she began, voice trembling, "that we were not forgotten." The inspector bowed his head slightly. "That will be enough." He turned and left. When the trucks drove away and the dust settled, silence returned to the camp. But it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, filled with questions no one could yet speak aloud. That night, around the small stove in the barracks, the women talked softly. "What will you tell your family?" Anna asked. Sabine stared into the flames. "If I tell them the truth, they will not believe me." They will think we are lying, Greta murmured, or betraying them. Maybe we are, Anna said bitterly. Betraying what we were taught. Greta shook her head. No, we are learning what it means to be human again. The fire crackled. Someone began to hum a lullaby, the same one that had drifted through the sewing room days before. Outside, the camp lights glowed through the fog. Somewhere near the chapel, Corporal Fisher made his rounds. He passed by their window and saw shadows moving across the curtains. Women gathered close, not afraid. He didn't knock, he didn't speak. He just stood there for a moment, listening to the faint sound of German voices singing softly into the night. It wasn't the sound of prisoners. It was the sound of people remembering they were alive. The mailbag arrived in a brown army truck, dusted with frost, like every Tuesday since the snow first came. Most of the letters inside were official, typed and bound in rubber bands. Some were returned envelopes, their paper brittle from long journeys that ended nowhere. Greta no longer expected mail. She had written 4 letters since arriving at Camp Ruston. 1 in December, 3 more scattered across the winter weeks, each quieter than the last. She had poured thoughts into them she wasn't sure she'd ever dared speak aloud. We were not starved. The guards do not hit us. They gave us soap, but no reply had come until that morning. The camp clerk, a young GI with a birthmark on his neck and hands always ink-stained from his logbook, appeared outside the women's barrack with a bundle of envelopes. "Mail call," he said, knocking once against the frame. "Hoffman, Greta?" She turned slowly. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. But there, in his outstretched hand, was a narrow envelope, soft at the corners, addressed in handwriting that buckled her knees. Helene Hoffman, Hamburg. Greta took it in both hands like it might break. There were no stamps, only censor markings, faded ink, a faint red X where the U.S. examiner had initialed approval. She didn't open it right away. She held it against her chest and went outside. Walking past the chapel, past the motor pool, to the edge of the camp's garden, where frost still lay beneath the empty rows of earth. There, beneath the tall pine trees, she sat on a bench and opened the envelope. Her mother's handwriting trembled on the page like it had traveled across fire. "My dearest daughter, your letter reached me in January. I held it against the stove until I could feel your voice again. You said you took a hot shower, that you were given soap, that you felt like a person again. Greta, my girl, that is the only warmth I have had in months." Greta blinked hard. Her eyes burned. The city is ash. The bakery is gone. The old schoolhouse was turned into a shelter, but then bombed. I sleep near the river now, in the back room of the post office with 6 others. Some nights we hear rats. Some nights we hear silence, which is worse. But I have read your letter 50 times. And I want you to know this. With all that is left of me, you are not a traitor for surviving kindly. You are not guilty for being treated like a human being. You are simply still alive. That is a kind of victory too. Greta's breath caught in her throat. We were taught many things, Greta. We sang songs we did not understand. We cheered for men we had never met. But none of it told us how to live when the world fell apart. Now we learn. Now you learn. And if a blanket can soften hatred, and if an apple can keep you from forgetting joy, then take those things with both hands and never let go of them. Because the world we must build will not be made from concrete or flags. It will be stitched together from small mercies. From hot water and soap, and someone handing you a coat without asking your name. If that is surrender, then I surrender too. Greta lowered the letter to her lap, eyes wide, chest full and hollow at once. The wind moved gently through the trees. A bird called out once, somewhere beyond the wire. She looked up toward the chapel and saw the chaplain leaning against the post, hands tucked in his sleeves. He didn't wave. He just nodded, as if he already knew. She folded the letter slowly, reverently, and placed it back into its envelope. Then she rose. On the way back to the barracks, she passed Corporal Fisher. He paused mid-step. "You all right?" he asked, voice quieter than usual. She looked at him, and for the first time, smiled without fear. "I got a letter," she said, "from home." He didn't ask what it said. He only nodded once. Glad to hear it. She wanted to tell him everything. About the river, the post office, the rats, the silence. But instead she said, "We are not traitors for surviving kindly." He blinked, and then, very softly, he said, "That's a good line." That evening, after roll call, Greta read the letter aloud to the others in Barrack 4. Some wept. Some closed their eyes and listened like it was a prayer. And when the last word was spoken, no one said anything. They simply sat there. Not as prisoners, not as Germans, not as enemies, but as daughters, as people. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in the room felt full. Not with fear, but with peace. The truck arrived just after dawn. Its engine rumbled low like a giant clearing its throat, cutting through the mist that still clung to the pines. A thin winter sun was rising behind the guard towers, spilling pale light across the frost-covered yard. Word spread quickly. Departure orders had come. The war had long since ended, and now, at last, the long journey home, or what remained of it, had begun. Greta stood by her bunk, hands pressed against the folded blanket that had been hers since December. She had washed it the night before. Not because anyone asked her to, but because it felt wrong to return it with the dust of sleep still clinging to its threads. All around her, the women packed their few belongings. Soap wrapped in cloth, letters tied with string, apple cores long dried, tucked away like sacred relics. A comb, a scarf, memories, not souvenirs. Anna folded her coat and smiled faintly. "We should be happy," she whispered. Greta nodded slowly. But joy was a strange shape now. Not sharp and sudden, but round and quiet. They filed out in silence, the way they had entered months ago. But everything was different now. Back then, they had walked like prisoners. Shoulders hunched, breath held, minds prepared for humiliation. Now, they moved like women who had remembered how to walk without fear. At the truck, Corporal Fisher stood waiting, clipboard in hand. He wore his wool coat, cap tilted slightly back, eyes squinting into the rising sun. When he saw Greta, he gave the smallest of nods. Their eyes met and held. Not a word was spoken. But in that look was everything. The blanket, the sleeve he'd mended without asking, the nights he'd walked past their windows without cruelty, the space he'd held open for their humanity to return. Greta stepped up into the truck bed. Wooden benches lined the sides. The other women were already seated, each with her parcel or pack held close. As the truck began to rumble forward, a gust of wind swept through the yard. Greta turned her head one last time, and for a single, still moment, she looked back. There was the laundry shed, the sewing room, the mess hall with its chipped trays and smells of fried potatoes, the chapel where the chaplain had played his harmonica in the cold, the door where the guards had once entered carrying wool blankets instead of rifles. Everything was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the invisible weight of what had been given. A hot shower after months of filth. A bite of apple that tasted like a lullaby. A patch of fabric that stitched something inside her heart. A letter from a mother who said kindness was no betrayal. As the truck reached the camp gate, the American flag flapped once in the wind, not proudly, not boastfully, but like a hand raised gently in farewell. And Greta, without thinking, raised her hand in return. The guard at the gate saw her. He didn't salute. He didn't smile. He just stood still, eyes following the truck as it rolled toward the road that led away from barbed wire and barracks, toward ships and ports and a country that had forgotten how to believe in anything except survival. Inside the truck, Anna whispered, "Will we ever be believed?" Greta didn't answer right away. She thought of her mother's words. "You are not a traitor for surviving kindly." Then she whispered back, "I don't know. But we will remember." They rode in silence after that. The wind grew colder as the trees gave way to fields. A hawk circled high above, cutting lazy arcs across the morning sky. No one sang, no one cried, but each woman carried something now that could not be taken by force: the memory of mercy, the feeling of dignity returned by a stranger's quiet act, the knowledge that even in a world broken by hatred, a blanket handed to you in the night, without fear, without motive, could become the most powerful thing in the world. And as the pine trees faded behind them, Greta leaned her head against the side of the truck and closed her eyes. She did not dream of barbed wire. She dreamed of warmth, of letters, of soap, of apples, and of the sound of boots outside the door. Not bringing fear, but bringing blankets. And that was how America had won her heart, not with weapons, not with bombs, but with the quiet, stubborn decision, even in victory, to choose decency, to treat the defeated not as monsters, but as women, as people, as someone's daughter. And that was a war-ending gesture, a kind of peace wrapped in wool.